Welcome back, everybody. We're going to start a little bit more with immunity now. Just kind of get you the intro here. This stuff's going to get a little bit more in depth as we go. I think there's probably going to be five shows of this, somewhere around there, with how I'm breaking it all down. Especially when you get into the T and B cell kind of responses, it does start to get a little bit in depth. Really, a lot of times why we do the immune system with the lymphatic system is, first off, as you've kind of already seen, lymphatic system in and of itself, there's not a lot going on with it. But the other thing is the immune cells are a big part of that system. They're in there quite a bit. The other thing that's kind of key with that one is the fact that there's not much there. There's a lot of immune cells there. I mean, you could also kind of do this stuff with blood, but we have enough things to talk about when we're doing blood and cardiovascular to not kind of put the stuff in there. So when it comes to immunity, we're really a lot of times talking about pathogenic organisms or pathogenic organisms. These organisms that can cause damage, cause problems to the host. I think everybody's pretty aware that viruses are on that list at this point. But again, outside of that, bacteria, fungi, not particularly often, but they can be a problem. And then there is some of these eukaryotic kind of protozoal or multicellular parasites that can sometimes be an issue. Bacteria, just to remind you, single-celled prokaryotic organisms usually have a cell wall, a number of different kinds, but I mean, to give you some examples, Streptococcus, pyogenes is like strep throat, the bacilli, there's some examples of that with Anthraxis bacillus. The Spirolia, you can get things like comma-shaped ones that are I'm forgetting the word right now. The really bad diarrhea type on that one where you get really quite bad. I'll remember it probably here in 5 minutes. These bacteria, like I said, can be a big problem. Spiroans, other ones like Lyme disease. Virulence is just how bad they cause issues. Generally, the worse the virulence, the more damage that particular organism is going to cause. Like I said, viruses, as we're pretty aware of, and at this point, it's kind of all that's been in the news. These are DNA or RNA-based non-living organisms. They pretty much have a genetic material inside a protein capsule. Makes it very difficult, as you're also all probably aware, to find ways to treat this, because really it's using the machinery of our cells to make something a lot like a computer virus. Uses your computer and makes the same code over and over again. And these ones, like it says, they're obligate intracellular parasites, meaning they can only be dividing or doing anything only when they're inside another cell that they infect. Again, generally the whole job of them is to make more of those same cells, and can be a lot of different issues. Obviously a lot of different diseases here, but I mean, everyone's aware right now, COVID-19, a viral type of infection. Fungi, these are more similar to our cells. Not usually a lot of different ones here, but I mean, yeast infection, for an example, is a fungal infection that's with yeast. You also have things like ringworm is not a worm, it's actually a fungus. Gives you a couple examples of these ones. Again, not a lot of diseases caused by these, but there is a few. And then, like it says there, ringworm is athlete's foot. It kind of said some of the ones already here. Histoplasmosis is fungus from bat dung. Bat guano. You do have protozoal ones here, things like malaria. Could talk about elephantitis being protozoans. Number ones here. Again, eukaryotic cells don't have cell walls, but definitely kind of more similar to our cells. Again, part of the reason treatments on these are a lot of times a lot more difficult. And then finally, there's a lot of parasitic worms, such as tapeworms, roundworms, that can infect a lot of times intestinal tracts, but other things as well, and can become a problem. Another thing that's really kind of one of these odd ones, kind of up there with viruses, is prions is another one here. These aren't cells, they're not viruses, they're actually an infectious protein. Mad cow disease is probably one of the best known examples of this, most widely known. You have Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease is the human version of that. They generally lead to plaque formation in the brain and can become a problem. Obviously, no treatment. Generally, almost all are degenerative and fatal over time. How we're going to fight a lot of this off is something that we've already talked about. It's using the leukocytes that are made by our bloodstream. So again, those granulocytes, innate granulocytes, and we're going to see it's kind of the combination of those, especially along with the lymphocytes, that you have these ability to actually have this specific immunity that we'll talk about that can really give you long-lasting immunity against something once you've been exposed to it. And we'll talk about ways we can expose people, ways they can build up this immunity, and kind of some of the basic responses that we have against this. So again, just to remind you of these ones, we've looked at them recently, but you have your different white blood cells. Like I said, this is part of the reason we could talk a lot about immunity as a cardiovascular thing. Most of this immune defense is taking place within the bloodstream. At least a number of the things that we're going to talk about definitely are. Throughout the body, and we just talked about this with the lymphatics, we have a number of different organs in the body that are also housing these immune cells, things like lymphatic tissues, certain organs. We have the mucosally associated lymphatic tissue, for example. We definitely have also the ability for neutrophils and macrophages to get into connective tissue and underlying epithelium to go after this stuff. Like I said, our lymph nodes, spleen, and mucosally associated lymphatic tissue are very much specialized for doing this. Many B and T lymphocytes to trigger immune responses, as well as macrophages that can kind of engulf and phagocytize stuff that is not supposed to be there. Again, some of these macrophages will be permanent, and they get certain names like the microglia in the brain, or you get alveolar macrophages, sometimes called dust cells in the lungs. Kupffer cells in the liver are some resident macrophages that are there. Outside of those resident ones, some of these are going to migrate and are wandering macrophages that leave the bloodstream and go out and find stuff that are monocytes that have left and will go and eat foreign materials that shouldn't be there. Some of the other thing that these cells do is they actually present those antigens to the specific immune system and allow us to trigger an immune response against that. Again, underlying the skin, we have things like dendritic cells that are also antigen-presenting cells. Pathogens that get into the skin, these can engulf those and show them to other immune cells, and they can actually migrate and trigger some other cells as well. We talked about basophils before. Mast cells are very similar to a basophil in connective tissue. A lot of times you can trigger an inflammatory response in that connective tissue. That would be another immune cell that's housed in another tissue. Lots of mast cells in the dermis. We talked about when we were looking at areolar connective tissue back in AMP1, that mast cells would be one of the cell types that would be present in there. So this, again, showing you where a lot of these different immune cells might be at, and that's really what this first one is doing. It's just kind of giving you an idea of where the immune cells are and what they might be doing. A lot of this is chemically triggered, and we're not going to get into crazy levels of this, but a lot of these immune cells can signal to other immune cells using what are called cytokines. These are small proteins that they can release. Again, both part of what we'll call the innate as well as the adaptive immunity. The innate immunity is the stuff that's just there. That adaptive immunity is that specific, long-lasting immunity that we can generate in our body. These cytokines a lot of times can be released from a certain cell, bind to a receptor on a target cell, or sometimes call other cells in. They can act back on the original cell that released it. They can act on neighboring cells. They can go out in the bloodstream in that endocrine fashion. Generally are not long-lasting ones here. They have a rather short half-life. They don't stay present in the blood for long, but these are ways we can really sound the alarm and call more immune cells into a particular area. And like I said, it's there. We are regulating with these ones. If you take immunology ever, you can get a lot into which cytokines are released when, which activate which type of cells. Again, with AMP, it's a matter of balancing kind of that introduction to this stuff without getting too deep. So we will talk about the idea of cytokines and might mention like a couple of the interleukins that are particular cytokines, but we're not going to get into these large cascades where we're talking about how this cell releases this cytokine that activates this one that releases a different cytokine in these really long drawn out kind of connected pathways with these cytokines. But again, a way to coordinate the immune system a little bit here, a way to communicate between different cells of the immune system and control some of these immune responses such as inflammation. We can also influence other cells to bring about, for example, pain in the in the body if you have damage to a tissue. So these can influence things that are not just immune cells as well. And some of these actually work to actually damage these infecting cells that are in there. So this gives you some examples of some cytokines. I just would like you to have an idea of what a cytokine is, some examples of it. But so for example, like interleukin 2 is a cytokine, and you can see some of these other ones would be cytokines. Interferons we'll talk about a little bit later. This is something that virally infected cells release specifically. But just having an idea of what are some examples of cytokines is really all I'm asking for on this part. The other thing we'll see is their immune system really has two main parts to it. I've mentioned this a little bit already with that idea of innate immunity versus adaptive. We're going to go through all the levels of this, but innate immunity versus something that's innate is something that's kind of inborn, something that's always present or always has been present. That's what we're talking about with innate immunity. This is something that's not targeted to a specific antigen at all. So innate immunity would be things like fever, inflammation, phagocytosis, all would be examples of some innate immunity type of things. Where adaptive immunity is going to be the work of those T and B cells, and these are things that have cellular memory, give you long-lasting immunity, and really a lot of times are what are really going to be about curing or getting rid of that particular infection versus just slowing its advance. A lot of the analogies, we'll get into this as we go, is a lot of war analogies, honestly, because it's a lot of these cells versus these cells and how that's kind of working. But again, we organize these based on which cells are involved. Is the immune response specific or not? I mean, and even something that's like fever, specific against specific more so against bacteria and somewhat against viruses, but it's not specific for a particular antigen, so that's why, again, it's still innate. Same thing with the interferons, it's against all viruses, not just a single one, so again, that's, again, part of that innate. We'll see the adaptive immunity, it takes a little bit more time to ramp up, but it is very specific in terms of what it's doing. So like I said, innate immunity, these are inborn defenses, some of which we'll talk about first here. We really kind of talk about the immune system being this three-tiered defense. I always kind of liken it to a medieval castle, that you have certain things that are just barrier defenses and then some more active defenses and then very specific infantry going out. So innate immunity is kind of these barriers and just non-specific type of responses. So things like the skin, like mucosal membranes, things like fever, those would be all stuff that would be part of that innate immunity. Where adaptive immunity, like I said, is using those T and B lymphocytes, either having the T lymphocytes go out and directly attacking foreign cells, or the B lymphocytes making antibodies that specifically attack foreign cells or foreign molecules or viruses or virally infected cells. And again, these ones are very specific. So like immunity against the chickenpox doesn't give you immunity against strep throat. So immunity against a virus doesn't give you immunity against a bacteria or vice versa. So, and we're seeing these ones take about 5 to 7 days up to a week to really kick up their responses. But again, very effective a lot of times about getting rid of that particular pathogen once this is activated. And again, this just kind of shows you the overview here. The immune system you can see up at the top there. Innate immunity is going to be the stuff we talk about first. So the next little show we'll talk about some of the skin and mucosal membranes. We'll then kind of do a couple looking at the couple halves of the non-specific defenses. And then we'll talk a little bit about T lymphocytes and then about B lymphocytes and what they do.